tables. Just if any of you have any thoughts or ideas of topics you'd like to see and that kind of thing, feel free to fill one of those out. And we have a ballot box close to the food over there on that high table. You can leave them in, fold them up and put them in, or you can just leave them on the table. We'll collect them all afterwards if you have any thoughts there. Yeah, and a big thank you to local roasters who donated our coffee today. They're over on East Douglas. If any of y'all have been to like 8th Day Books, they're right by there. They've got great locally roasted coffees. And today, the coffee that they donated is called Copycat Blend. And that is a medium dark roast. Next month's speaker is going to be Jillian Forsberg, local business owner and an alumnus of the Museum of World Treasure's own education department. Jillian will be giving a talk on April 17th called The Rhino Keeper, How a Kansas Zoo Inspired a Novel. Jillian got her master's in public history from Wichita State University and wrote a book of historical fiction based on the true story of an 18th century Dutch sea captain who traveled with an Indian rhinoceros called Clara, who dazzled audiences across Europe. Today, we're delighted to host Deborah Hann, Assistant Professor of Geography at Emporia State University. Professor Hann teaches a wide variety of geography courses, including World Regional Geography, Food, Culture, and Place, the World in Film, and the History of Cartography. She loves teaching geography because of the way it allows her to explore her curiosity about the people, places, and patterns that are all around us. After earning her Ph.D. from Texas State University, San Marcos, and before landing at Emporia State, she taught at both Texas State and Kansas State University. Her current research focuses on exploring the geography that is carried in the everyday pieces of material culture, such as cookbooks, literature, and movies. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Deborah Hann.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out this morning. I'm really excited to share this information with you and talk about the Columbian Exchange. So we are going to talk about some history, and we're also going to talk about some geography. Obviously, I'm a geographer, but we're going to be exploring how the Columbian Exchange changed the patterns of everything you can think of, really, all over the world. And that's what geography is all about, patterns, right? And patterns on the Earth's surface. So one quick thing, I fell a couple weeks ago and dislocated my shoulder. So if you see me wince or gasp, that's because I'm still learning how to reuse it. So I just wanted to say that. So Columbian Exchange, globalization, what is this stuff? So the first question that I have is, what's globalization? We don't necessarily think about it every day, but it affects our lives every day. So globalization then is the increasing interconnectedness. That's what really the key word of globalization. Things are becoming more interconnected all over the world, and it is affecting all aspects of our life, from the food that we eat, to the entertainment that we consume, to the patterns of politics and economics, and transportation and communication, and all of those things. Part of it is, of course, the connectivity of the internet, but it is also just that connection between distant places. The fact that we can move information and money and data and all those people very quickly now. So the world is more interconnected and interdependent than it ever has been. And so what does that look like, other than the fact that we can get things like flowers and fruit from Chile when it's not in season here, and that our governments are making international trade deals? Well, this is an example. Does anybody know what that is a picture of? It's a mountain with a kind of a pillar in the middle, and they're putting it up. This was the crew that was putting the 5G network in at the highest base camp and the top of Everest. So if you make it to the top of Everest, you can make a 5G call and let all your friends know. That's pretty amazing, right? That interconnectivity is part of globalization. This is also an example of globalization. Not necessarily this, because this is, of course, one of the most ancient wonders of the world, but the fact that just a few feet away from the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids is a Pizza Hut. You can sit in this Pizza Hut and enjoy a brand of pizza that began here in Kansas and gaze out over these monuments. That's connectivity. Okay? So is this, the fact that President Trump is interested in regaining control of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is really important for world trade. Somewhere around $200 billion a year goes through it, which sounds like a big number until, I mean, I could live on that. I would find a way to live on $200 billion a year. But when you consider that the South China Sea has trillions of dollars that go through it, it looks a little bit smaller, but it's still really important for world trade. It's about 5% of the global trade that goes through it, but it's about 40% of the United States trade. So it's clear that there is a vested interest with the United States making sure that they have access to the Panama Canal. So these are all examples of globalization. And globalization and this interconnectivity, it has a lot of different reactions. Some people are very positive about globalization. They think it's the best thing ever, that we're going to have more cultural exchange and everybody is going to become more wealthy and the world will become more prosperous because of those connections. And then there's other people who think that this is not a good thing, that it's not going to change the inherent patterns and poverty, that it's going to just continue to have inequities, that there's interdependency that we shouldn't be having. So this sparks a lot of feelings. But better or worse, it's changed the world. And it has changed the world, of the entire world, not just a region or a continent, and it's changed it very quickly. Think about the changes in the last even 40 years, if in the last 20, right? So this is thought of as being a change that is covering a wider area than the domestication of plants and animals, than the Industrial Revolution, and the medical revolution with antibiotics and things like that. So globalization, a force in the world. Okay? So where exactly did this come from? Well, it's a really good question, and there's a lot of debate about it. But one of the leading proponents is that it began with the colonialism and mercantilism and imperialism and that connectivity between largely countries in Europe with other parts of the world. And it established trade links, politics, economics, right? Culture, all of those things. This map right up here always blows my mind because that color that North and South America are in, and you can see how widespread it is in the world, all of those are territory that was colonized by Europeans at some point between the 1500s and the 1900s. And there's very little of that paler kind of manila color. And those are the only places that were not colonized at some point during that time period. So clearly, colonization also had a wide impact. And many people feel that it was the beginnings of this globalization. So then, our starting point for this talk and talking about the Columbian Exchange is this. What happened on that date? Yes, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And where did he end up? Where do we think his first landing was?
Bahamas?
Yeah, in the Bahamas probably. Somewhere, maybe San Salvador, or maybe there's a variety of different ideas. But that is what his first voyage looked like. And from that moment, the Western Hemisphere began to change. And the Eastern Hemisphere began to change. Yes, there had been some contact between Europeans and the peoples and the locations of the Western Hemisphere. The Bering Strait, of course, is how early humans had gotten to North and South America, but it disappeared somewhere between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago underwater as ocean levels rose after the Ice Age. There's also a few Viking voyages that ended up in what is now Canada, maybe the northern part of the United States. And then most intriguingly to me, because I really had not realized this, but there are some signs of contact with Polynesia and the islands in Polynesia because they have some crops, some plants that came from the Western Hemisphere. So they had to get there somehow. So there is signs of contact with Polynesia, but those were very isolated contacts. And so there wasn't a lot of interchange between the two hemispheres, and with the Bering Strait being cut off, it had been a minimum of 10,000 years before there had been any widespread contact between the peoples and the animals and the places and all of those things. So from that moment, from October 12, 1492, the two hemispheres began to become alike. And that is what the Columbian Exchange is all about. This is a book called The Columbian Exchange by Alfred Crosby, and he goes into this in great deal. It's a really fun book to read, but he points out that the Columbian Exchange is so wide-ranging and so impactful that it's easy to overlook. It's easy to forget just how world-changing the contact between the two hemispheres were, because it impacted archaeology, in history, botany, medicine, demography, right? Population patterns, who lived, who died, where we lived, culture, from everything from how we cook to how we grow our food to how we build our houses, socioeconomic levels, agriculture, nutrition, and beyond. Really, all the things that we can think have been impacted by this contact. And of course, one of the big pieces of the Columbian Exchange was the movement of people. And so settlers came from eventually all over the world. At first, it was, of course, largely Europeans that were driving these movements of people, but there were others who came later. But that pattern of people moving to this new hemisphere definitely had an impact, as we all know. But of course, not all of the people who came chose to come. It was not a choice for millions and millions of enslaved people from Africa. And this is a flow map showing where people came from and then where they ended up. And the width of the arrow shows the magnitude, how many people were coming. So the number of people who came from Western Africa and were kidnapped and taken to North America was somewhere around 400,000 people. A little less is what we have estimated. But compare the size of that number with the impact that the descendants of these people have had on American culture. And then consider the size of those other arrows, especially the arrow to Brazil, where it was more than 3.5 million people who were enslaved and forcibly transported, and the impact that they have had on this region as well. So this too is part of the Columbian Exchange, right? And the ugliness and the power differential of slavery. And that impact, those groups of people who were brought here throughout the Western Hemisphere, had, of course, a huge impact on our culture. Things like Carnival has had a huge impact with the cultures coming together, especially in places like the Caribbean, where Europeans and some of the indigenous people that were already there, plus the enslaved Africans, melded their cultures together to create new ways of celebrating Carnival, of making music like calypso and samba, which is what she's dancing right here. There also were new religions that began, things like Vodun, which is more commonly called voodoo, but the correct name is Vodun, and Santeria. And so this whole set of practices that combine things like Catholicism with Western African beliefs, joining together to create new practices. So that is an impact of the Columbian Exchange, with these people coming into contact with each other, living together, and influencing each other. So those are some of the ripples of this new contact and new interconnection, but there were, of course, lots more. And one of the things that we don't always think about is the power of the two hemispheres coming into contact with each other, and the way that changed people's worldview, the way that it shifted the way that we think about the world and ourselves and our place in it. Some of these were really foundational rocking of just perceptions and assumptions about the way the world works. So, for example, the idea of how large the planet actually was. Right? There are people who think, well, Columbus thought he was going to sail off the end, right, of the edge of the planet. We knew that the Earth was round at that point. And there were an awful lot of people who knew how large the planet was. In fact, Eratosthenes in Greece in the 3rd century BCE, had calculated the circumference of the planet within very few kilometers. It's about 40,000 kilometers, and he came within about 500 kilometers of that. It was astonishing how close he got. But what Columbus was using was some later calculations that Ptolemy made And he may have been using smaller units. Somewhere there was a miscalculation. And so what Columbus was working with and what he believed was that the planet was about 75% of what it is actually. So the fact that there was this whole other hemisphere, these huge continents in the way of getting to Asia to be able to tap into the spice trade, that was definitely a world shift for many people. Also, since Christianity was one of the biggest influences and structures of people's lives in the age of exploration, the fact that the Christian way of viewing the world, the structure of the cosmogony and the worldview was also shaken by contact with these new continents, new peoples, and new species. Because at the time, the prevailing view was, of course, that there was 1 week of creation, and it happened in one place, and then all life spread from there. And then that life was also altered and constrained by Noah's flood and the ark, that the only animals that had survived were the ones that were saved. So then when they landed in these new islands and these new continents, they found huge differences in the flora and the fauna that were here in these continents than they were used to in Europe and Africa and even Asia. So if there was creation only in one place, and that's where everything came from, why was the flora and the fauna so wildly different? That would be a worldview, a change that would rock your perceptions of the world. So too was the idea that the people here did not worship gods that they had mentioned, that were mentioned in biblical writings, writings of the time, things like Baal or other demons. These were people who had never heard those names. They worshipped people with completely different names. So if they were worshiping other gods, what did that mean for who they were? Were they subject to the Pope and subject to their monarch's rule? Were they actually human? These were questions that people were wrestling with, because that answered the question of, could they be subjugated? Could they be enslaved and worked on the plantations? Could they be killed to clear the land for what the Europeans wanted to do? If they were human and subject to the Pope's edicts, then they couldn't do that. They shouldn't be killing these people and pushing them off their land. But if they were something else, that made it much easier for the Europeans to come in and sweep things away. So all of these are pieces of the way that the people who were coming to the New World were viewing things and then had those ideas shaken. But views changed in the Western Hemisphere as well, because with the indigenous people and the Europeans coming, the people there encountered new people, new technology, new demands. Right? These pictures both show the contact and some of the early conflicts. But in many cases, the indigenous groups never actually saw the Europeans, because the diseases that the Europeans were carrying as part of the Columbian Exchange pushed ahead. Right? So someone, a runner or a scout, other people who had seen these new people went inland, and they brought the diseases that they were exposed to. So many people died before they actually saw the Europeans. So this too, part of the Columbian Exchange. And those diseases were unlike anything that people in the Western Hemisphere had been in contact with for over 10,000 years. Right? So there was no immunity to the diseases and the plagues that were in the Eastern Hemisphere. And these were dramatic diseases. These are the plagues. These are the diseases that cause widespread death. And many of them came from living in contact with domesticated animals in ways that people in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, did not. So smallpox was one of the ones that was the most virulent and had the most impact, but there were many others as well. And this quote from a Franciscan monk who was traveling with Cortez really shows that impact and the way that it rocked the cultures, the civilizations, and just daily life throughout the Western Hemisphere. They did not know a remedy for the disease. They died in heaps like bed bugs. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, they pulled down the houses over them so that their houses became their tombs. Think about how that must have looked for the people who were managing to survive and the way that people around them were just disappearing in droves. Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec Empire, where Mexico City is now, they lost at least 40% of their population in a single year. In many places, a third to the half of the population died, and died very quickly. And everyone was sick at the same time. And these diseases were felling people in ways that they were unfamiliar with. The symptoms were different. The treatments that they were familiar with didn't work. And so the suffering was exacerbated by that. And then there were ancillary effects, things like famine, because there weren't enough people to work the fields and to plant the crops or to bring food to the people who were sick. So suddenly everything, the underpinnings of daily life, were absolutely destroyed in ways that were shocking and devastating. And so this too was a challenge of a worldview. And it led to power vacuums, like in Tenochtitlan, the king, the emperor, Montezuma, who's shown here with Cortez, which may never have actually happened, but he died very quickly, and then there was a power vacuum. Who exactly was his heir going to be? His nephew took over, and then he died very rapidly. And so did a number of the generals and the leaders of all the military, a bunch of the high-ranking nobles within Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, and there was a massive power vacuum that Cortez and his army were able to take advantage of, and to make treaties and to be able to sweep in and take over. So Cortez actually admitted that the conquest was made much easier by the fact that these people were very susceptible to the diseases that were afflicting them. And another piece of the worldview that this led to was a psychological effect, because the societal foundations were decimated. There was all of that suffering. Things like smallpox led to scarring and pox and movement, and your skin being disrupted. I do have some pictures of smallpox and the effects on the body, and so I just wanted to warn you about that. But the fact that your skin ended up erupting into things like this, and that it hurt, right? And that you were being devastated. This is actually monkeypox over here. This is a modern picture, but it would have very similar ulcers to what was often seen with smallpox. So the fact that these things were affecting their bodies, while the Europeans seemed largely impervious to this, that too was something that affected people psychologically and helped the invaders conquer, because people were so dispirited. And then, of course, there were lasting effects as well, right? The pock marks that would affect people, blindness caused by smallpox, and all of those other things if you did manage to survive. So this too was a large shift and a large impact on the worldview of people throughout the Americas. And the smallpox and the other diseases that were brought, of course, led to the globalization of disease. The fact that there was contact between the two hemispheres meant that these diseases obviously could spread, and that leads all the way up to today, right? With things like the coronavirus and Zika and malaria, all of the tuberculosis, the fact that we've seen an uptick in tuberculosis, the fact that we're seeing more cases of measles. Part of that is that interconnectivity with other parts of the world, where those diseases, except smallpox, happily, are still endemic. Any questions at this point? Okay. So what were these diseases? I mentioned smallpox already, but what were the diseases that were exchanged back and forth? Well, what were some of the other diseases that the Europeans brought with them? Measles, yep. Syphilis, that's an interesting question. Others? There's a bunch.
Scarlet fever?
Scarlet fever. There's the list. That's at least a partial list. Smallpox, measles, the flu, typhus and typhoid fever, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, bubonic plague, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, chickenpox. That's some heavy hitters there, right? Those are some of the most deadly diseases that we know of that we still have trouble fighting some of them. And so there's huge number of bacteria and viruses and parasites that traveled with Europeans both deliberately and not deliberately, definitely had an impact. How about from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere? What were the diseases there? There's really only one, syphilis. That's it. And even that we have questions about. But there were not poxes, there were not pandemics or plagues in the Western Hemisphere the way that there were in the Eastern Hemisphere for a variety of reasons. But one of the biggest is that most of these diseases, chickenpox, very similar to cowpox, malaria, very similar, measles, very similar to rinderpest in cattle. There had been time for bacteria and diseases in animals, domesticated animals, to transfer to people. And the cities were all tightly packed people, and so they spread very well. In the Western Hemisphere, they did not live with domesticated animals in the same way. Their cities were quite different and much cleaner. So there were not these huge plagues, these vast diseases that would wipe out large numbers of people. Syphilis, however, seems to have gone the other way, though we do need to have some provisos with this. Was this a Western Hemisphere disease, or was it already in the Eastern Hemisphere? There are some other diseases that are caused by the treponema bacteria, things like yaws, which is a skin infection largely of children, Bejel and Pinta, which are deeper infections deeper inside the body, that are caused by the same bacteria. And even under an electron microscope, we can't tell the differences between the bacteria that cause things like yaws and that cause syphilis. So we are now finding bodies that are buried in the Eastern Hemisphere that have traces of this bacteria. So we know that it had been here for a very long time, but it's likely that the syphilis form and the fact that it moves through contact, through sexual contact, it was a more virulent form, at least. And it may have also combined with some other things. And there were a large variety of names for this disease that suddenly started spreading like wildfire throughout Europe, because everybody was blaming everybody else. And the fact that there's all of these new names gives us good evidence that this was a new thing. Italians called it the French disease, the French called it the disease of Naples, the English called it the Bordeaux disease or the Spanish disease, Russians called it the Polish disease, the Poles blamed the Germans, Middle Easterners called it the European pustules. In India, they called it the disease of the Franks. The Chinese called it the ulcer of Canton, because Canton was one of the largest ports where there was contact from people with other parts of the world. The Japanese called it the Tang sore, after the Tang dynasty in China. So everybody was blaming everybody else for this disease, and it was nasty. It was a particularly virulent and violent form of the disease. This person is actually mixing up mercury, which was really the only semi-effective cure at the time. And then, of course, it had its own toxic effects. But there's an awful lot of evidence that this was at least a new form of this bacteria, or a more virulent form. So what else? We've talked about the worldview, we've talked about diseases and the globalization of disease that kicked off with the Columbian Exchange, but there's all sorts of other contact and transfer, that some of which were deliberate and some of which were accidental. And things like the daisy. We're used to seeing daisies as wildflowers, having them in bouquets, but those actually come from places like England. They are not native to anywhere in North or South America. Neither is this grass. And I know this is a little challenging, but does anybody recognize that grass? It just kind of looks like grass to me. But this is actually Kentucky bluegrass. The fact that it has Kentucky in its name is only because we now have planted it there. Kentucky bluegrass actually came from large parts of Europe and North Africa, like Morocco. So it is not a native indigenous plant. It was brought as part of the Columbian Exchange. So too are dandelions. Dandelions are, they're everywhere. We think of them largely as a weed, but they have a large number of medicinal purposes that have been used as all sorts of cures, and the greens and the salads for very long times across Europe. And that is why they were brought to the New World deliberately, so that they could still tap into those medicines and the food. Another one that we may not think of very often is squirrels. The gray squirrel is native to North America, but it has invaded Europe. All of these things are invasive species, and the gray squirrels have been decimating the red squirrels that are indigenous to Europe. So these impacts, whether they were deliberate or not, have ripple effects on the places where these species end up, because there's no predators for them. Right? There's nothing to hold them in check. And so they tend to take over and push the native species out. So that's definitely a piece of this. But the most famous aspect of the Columbian Exchange is the food crops and the animals that were transferred between the two hemispheres. So how has the Columbian Exchange impacted the food that people eat all over the world? So I have a quick task to help us answer that question. And I have handouts so that we can all play with this. And you work together as a table, as couples, as in pairs, whatever you like. But we're gonna work with the first two columns here, and think about and brainstorm where you think, what associations you have with these crops and animals, where you think of them coming from in today's world, and also where you think the first crop, they were first domesticated. Okay? And then leave the third column alone for the moment, because we'll do that as a group. Okay? So this is going to help us appreciate the extent and the impact of the Columbian Exchange by seeing just how many of the foods that we eat all the time and where they actually came from. Okay? So of course. Absolutely. There you go. Okay, so take your best guesses. There's, of course, no score for this. Okay? I'm not going to grade you, but have fun brainstorming some things. Oh, damn.
One for myself.
Please do. All right.
Great on time.
Well, that's what you think.
Extra minutes.
Okay.
Because we started late.
Thank you. Thank you.
They had them in Israel. Well, some. But that was wild. And that's not the rest. Yeah, they were called horses. Well, they did.
Okay, about another minute and a half, and then we'll talk about this. Okay, let's play with this. Okay, so we're going to run through this list. And so I have questions for you like, what associations do you have for rice and rice dishes? Where do you think of? Asia? Name me some foods that have rice. Things like fried rice, right? Sushi, those kinds of things. You may even think of like when we go to a Mexican restaurant, right? There's rice and there's beans as the two main sides. Right? The fact is that those never existed because before the Columbian Exchange. Not that there were a lot of Mexican restaurants floating around at the time, but because rice was not part of the agriculture within the Western Hemisphere. There were some forms of wild rice, especially in the northern parts of North America around like the Great Lakes, but that's actually different in some ways. And so the rice that we tend to think of came from Asia somewhere over here. So each one of these maps that I'll pull up, there's a star where the hearth, where the origin, where these crops or the animals were first domesticated are. Okay, so rice was a fairly easy one. How about chilies? What foods do you associate with chili peppers? Mexican food, absolutely. Right, the wreaths and the strings of dried chili peppers that you see all over the place. Asian food, Thai food, kung pao chicken, right, with the peppers that you need to make sure that you don't chomp on. The sriracha sauce is actually from Vietnam. Things like pad thai from Thailand, all of these things have chilies. Kimchi, the fermented cabbage that is one of the national dishes of Korea. Indian food is spicy because of these peppers, but where did the peppers actually come from? They actually came from South America and Central America. That's where they're actually from. So all of these dishes that we enjoy, that these cultures are famous for, like Kung Pao chicken, Thai food, Korean food, Indian food, none of those existed the way we are now familiar with them until the Columbian Exchange happened, and until those crops, those particular chilies reached these areas. Not even paprika, which is ground up chilies, which is so famous in, say, Hungarian cooking, that too was part of the Columbian Exchange. So these cultural associations that we have all over the world, that too is a ripple effect of these early pieces of globalization from the Columbian Exchange. How about coffee? When you think of the coffee that you drink, where does it come from? Colombia, Brazil, Africa, right? I think we are old enough to remember Juan Valdez and his donkey, right? My students have no reference point for that, so it's nice to be talking to people who do this. So Colombia, right? Jamaican blue coffee is very famous. So is Brazilian coffee, right? All of these are associations of where coffee is now grown. It actually originally came from what is now Ethiopia. That is our best evidence of where we think it was. Did anybody get that one? Nicely done, Keenan. Nice. Oh, well, see, you had insider information. Yes. Yeah, exactly, cheater. Yemen was very early on, but it looks like it originally came from Ethiopia. Does anybody know the folktale involving goats that talk about the discovery of coffee? So the story goes that there was a young shepherd boy who was out with his goats, and they wandered further than they usually went, and he noticed that his goats were very peppy. They were jumping around a lot, they seemed very active, and he was getting a little tired of chasing them, and he started looking around trying to figure out what was going on. He noticed that they had been eating some red berries from a bush he'd never seen before, and so he was a little worried about his goats. So he took some of the berries back to his village. They tried them. They too felt very peppy. And so they started messing with them. They boiled them, and those were, of course, coffee beans. So that's the legend of how coffee was discovered. Take that with a massive grain of salt. But it's a fun story to tell, right? It's a great folktale. Okay? How about manioc or cassava? Okay? So this is not a crop that we talk about a lot in this country, but it comes in a lot of different shapes. It's called manioc, it's called cassava. We call it something slightly different. We're a bit more familiar with it now because of cassava flour, which is what is right there, because it has become very popular for things like keto cooking and low carb cooking. But what do you have to do to cassava, to manioc, to be able to eat it? You got to pound the crud out of it, and you have to rinse it because it has prussic acid in it. You can't just eat the raw root, and that is what these are. Some of the roots get to be 2 to 4 feet long. So these are huge things that people are eating. We are more familiar with it by a different name. What is that name? Tapioca. Tapioca pudding and boba tea, the pearls in a boba tea, those are tapioca. It also is called yuca in many parts of Latin America. So it's all the same plant, and it is a tropical plant that is now grown all over the world. It is incredibly important to diets all over Africa, especially. Per acre of land, the cassava, the manioc, produces more calories than any other tropical plant. It doesn't have a lot of protein, but it has many, many different uses, and it is high in nutrition for other things. So where did it come from then? What do you think? New World or Old World? Old? Actually, new. This actually came from what is now Brazil, from the southern parts of the rainforest. It is, as I said, a tropical plant, and then it spread. And it has become a major product, a major food source in many, many parts of the world, especially in Africa. And one semester I was teaching at K-State, and we were talking about this, and I had a student from Ghana, and he was deeply offended that I was saying that this was not a plant species that came from Africa, because it shook his perceptions of this being an ancient food that tied back to his ancestors. when in reality it could not have been there for more than about 400 years. This is those deep-rooted cultural feelings and associations we have that were transformed by the Columbian Exchange. Isn't that amazing? How about sweet potato? What associations do you have with sweet potato? How do we tend to eat it here? The casserole, right? Thanksgiving, that kind of thing. Fries, exactly, thank you, absolutely. But topped with marshmallows for a lot of people, though, no thank you. But any other cultural associations, any other foods that you think of having sweet potatoes featured in them? I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble understanding you. I'm not trying to ignore you. So shout that back out a little bit louder. Soul food, nice, definitely. There are a number of soups and dishes across Africa that have sweet potato and peanuts, especially. There's also tempura sweet potato in Japan that is one of the more popular kind of appetizer kind of things, side dishes. They actually come from South America. I apologize that this map is a completely different projection and perspective, but this is the only one that I can find. The sweet potato actually came from South America and spread all over the world, where it has become vital to the diet of many people all over the place. Yeah. Okay, how about the pineapple? What associations do we have for the pineapple? Hawaii, absolutely, right? It is the flavor of aloha. The Dole plantation, you can go and visit and see the original fields. I did that last April and it was fascinating. But it actually is from South America. So it actually took the long way around. This is a Western Hemisphere crop that then ended up in places like Hawaii taking the long way around. The Spanish and the Portuguese took it back to Europe, and then the Spanish took it across the oceans to places like the Philippines, which was one of their colonies, and then from the Philippines it ended up in the Pacific Islands and in Hawaii. So this is kind of a weird one. It is a Western Hemisphere crop, and that's what I just realized I didn't say that's what the third column is for, if you'd like to mark them. It's a Western Hemisphere crop that took the long way around to get to other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Yep. Maize. What do we have associations for maize? Corn Belt, right? The fact that we can walk out to fields all over the place and see the corn, absolutely. Corn is actually a New World crop, but it was in Mexico and somewhat to the South and Central America. It was not in what we now think of as the United States and Canada. And then it spread all over the world where it has become very important. But what do most other people use it for? We eat it as like corn on the cob and stuff, but what do other people use it for? Exactly. It is one of the most important animal feeds in the world. Right? And it used to look quite different than what we are used to. We have really focused on the yellow corn, right? I'm sure you are all more abundantly aware of this than I am, but corn used to be a much more diverse plant. And here's a fun fact. The original plant that became what we now have as corn was only an inch and a half long, and it probably had less nutrition in it than a single kernel of the corn that we eat today. How's that for amazing and genetic engineering, right? Done in the lab of the fields over thousands and thousands of years. How about cocoa or cacao? Where do you think of chocolate coming from today? Africa, nice. Mexico, South America, absolutely. What are the famous chocolates that people think of as being high class or high quality chocolate? Switzerland, Belgium, German. There's German chocolate cake, which is of course not from Germany, it's from the United States. The brand was German. Belgian chocolate, right? All of these fancy things. There's now really fancy, very popular chocolate from Dubai. And it was actually from Central America and spread north into what is now Mexico in cultures like especially the Aztec, where it was seen as the food of the gods. They ground it up, it was quite bitter because they did not have the sugar and the milk that Europeans added later, but it was consumed as a very frothy drink and was incredibly important to a large number of the beliefs and the rituals and daily parts of life. Okay, how about the potato? Where are potatoes grown today? Idaho, right? Idaho potatoes. Where else is famous for potatoes? Yes, right? There's the Mr. Potato Head. There's the Irish gold potatoes, right? Those are definitely the associations. Heck, there was a famine in Ireland called the potato famine, right? And it led to huge numbers of Irish people ending up in the United States to escape that fungus that was destroying the crop. Did not exist in Ireland, in German food, in Russian food, until the mid-1600s, if not later. It probably did not reach Ireland until the late 1600s. Think about how that transformed people's lives in Ireland, in Russia, where it became incredibly important. But the potato was first cultivated by the Inca in the Andes Mountains. And it too is much more diverse than the potatoes that we are used to seeing now. There are hundreds of different kinds of potatoes that are still grown in places like Peru, up in the mountains. Okay. Wheat, where does wheat grow now? Kansas, yes, the wheat belt, right? All up and down the prairies in central North America. But it actually is an old world crop. It is from the Eastern Hemisphere. It was originally cultivated in what is probably now Iraq, in the Fertile Crescent and that area, and then spread very rapidly to places like the Mediterranean. Wheat was actually one of the first crops that Europeans often planted. Why? Why were they so focused on wheat? Bread, yeah, everybody likes bread, okay, but why was bread so darn important to them? Remember what controlled an awful lot of life at this point. Christianity, Catholicism was incredibly important. You needed the wheat to be able to serve the bread for communion. And one of the second most important crops for Europeans to plant with mixed success throughout the Western Hemisphere was grapes, because you needed the wine as well. So this was a piece of culture transference of religion coming. How about tomatoes, our last crop? What foods do you associate the most with tomatoes? Italy, right? The tomato sauce, the secret recipe, pizza, spaghetti and meatballs, all of those fabulous things. You know how this goes. Were the Italians the people who cultivated the tomato? No, they too were an Andean crop. They were originally cultivated by the Inca. They did not reach Italy until the 1700s. So the pasta that we think of the way pasta is, and lasagna and pizza and all of those things, did not exist until the Columbian Exchange. But that is the power of culture and associations. The potatoes and the tomatoes are the ones that throw my students the most. Which ones did you find the most surprising? Chocolate? Think about that, let me know. Okay, so this is what the Columbian Exchange is really, really famous for, right? These are invasive or exotic species. These were transferred into environments that they had never been before, and they can cause harm. We think of them as good things because we like things like pizza and steaks and wheat and bread, right? All of those things are great, but they lack predators in these areas, and they've changed the biodiversity. In fact, the Columbian Exchange actually decreased the world's biodiversity. There were more people who had more choice of crops, and they actually got more nutrition, but the overall biodiversity of the world went down because more people were farming only a few things. And the native plants were getting wiped out to make room for the fields. So there used to be a whole bunch more biodiversity in both hemispheres. Yeah. Okay. Like I said, the available calories went way up. In many Western Hemisphere crops were more flexible with the soil that they would tolerate, and so soil that was being underutilized, slopes of hills, river body, all sorts of places that weren't very effective for European crops. These new crops could be planted and produce a lot of food for both humans and animals. Cassava, like I mentioned, produces more food by weight of unit of land of any other tropical plant. It's also drought resistant, pest resistant, soil tolerant, so it'll grow almost anywhere, and that's been very handy. The potato, 1.5 acres could produce enough to feed a family for a year in Ireland. And people were, at the time of the potato famine, people were regularly eating 10 pounds of potatoes each per day. That is a lot of potato. Can you imagine how tired of potato they must have been? Does anybody recognize that picture? Does anybody know where that is? It's not Boston, it's actually Japan. This is a Shinto shrine in Japan dedicated to the sweet potato, because when it arrived, it saved thousands and thousands of people from famine. Huge number of calories, very easy to grow, and it dramatically increased nutrition in Japan. This is a chart showing the 10 places where the most cassava is grown, manioc, tapioca. And how far down the list of the top 10 do you need to get to be the Western Hemisphere country? 6. The places that produce the most cassava are Southeast Asia and Africa. That is the Columbian Exchange. Look how much they produce in Nigeria. I mean, that's way more than in Brazil, or even the next one, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a map that shows the production of sweet potatoes around the world. Look at China. You believe that? That's just mind-blowing. And it, of course, did not exist there before the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so we did some crops. Let's very quickly go through the animals. Horses. Where are horses from? Spain, the Old World, China. They actually were probably first domesticated in what we now think of as Central Asia. Here is the Caspian Sea, there's the Black Sea. So in the plains of places like Kazakhstan is where we think of these animals coming from and being first domesticated. But we have these romantic, idealized versions of Native Americans, Plains Indians, roaming across the prairie, pursuing bison on their fabulous horses. Did that exist before Europeans came here? Absolutely not. They were not an ancient part of life anywhere in the Americas. They were brought by Europeans to the Western Hemisphere. But interestingly, wild horses and cattle actually preceded Europeans in many places across the plains. The prairies here, the Llanos and the Pampas in South America, they would escape and go wild and move through the prairies chasing the grass. And so in many cases, the Native Americans encountered a horse or a cow before they actually encountered the humans. So that was an interesting change. And indigenous people adapted to the livestock faster than they adapted to the new crops that were being introduced. It was much easier to fit into their livelihoods. Okay? So horses and cattle, what were the other Eastern Hemisphere animals? Pigs and sheep. Those are the big 4. There were a few others, but those are the big 4. Those are the Eastern Hemisphere animals. The Western Hemisphere animals are the llamas and the turkeys. Those are the only animals that were domesticated that have been used for commercial use that were for the Western Hemisphere. And the llamas, they're important, but what are they the most important for? And so are alpacas. Their wool, right? They were not used for transportation the way horses and oxen were. Horses and oxen are able to carry much more, drag much more than a llama is. Llamas were not a major transportation form. People didn't ride them in armies the way that they did horses. And so when people were moving things, building monuments, doing all those things, they were doing so by foot. They were not using the llamas throughout the Western Hemisphere, and llamas, of course, were in South America, so were alpacas, not in North America. So then, how do you think we should, oh wait, does anybody have questions about any of those? Okay. So what do you think? Should we be regretful about the Columbian Exchange and the changes that it wrought? It lowered biodiversity. It led to the enslavement of millions of people. It led to widespread death from war, disease, and famine. Millions of people died in the Western Hemisphere because of it. On the other hand, there were good things, right? First of all, we have things like pad thai and pizza. That's all good, right? But we actually went up in number of calories, which is one of the reasons that the population has steadily increased since the 1800s especially. So humans overall have had better nutrition since the Columbian Exchange. And we live here, right? So we're appreciative of that. But how do you think we should feel about the Columbian Exchange? Mixed. It was necessary. It was going to happen anyway. Those are all valid responses. I think we should be both. Regretful for the evil that it helped perpetrate, but appreciative for the fact that it has created this amazing world that we live in now. But we do need to be aware of it and respectful of the fact that it did cause a huge amount of damage, culturally, to people, demographically, and in terms of biodiversity of our planet. So thank you so much for playing with that activity. What questions can I answer? Yes?
Oh, I'm curious, it's called the Columbian Exchange. I didn't hear the word Columbia in it.
Yes, so I did not mention Columbia because Columbia is named after the same thing that the Columbian Exchange is named after. It's named for Columbus. So at the beginning we were talking about him arriving. That's the point from which we talk about the contact between the two hemispheres. So it's called the Columbian Exchange after Christopher Columbus. Other questions?
And I have a microphone for anyone who has a question so that everyone can hear. Don't miss anybody.
Yes.
I'm always amazed at the details that are given about how do you find out that so many years ago this person died of syphilis. Or different things like that. The details from so many hundreds, thousands of years ago.
Isn't it amazing the things that we can now know? That one of the reasons that syphilis, especially early on when it came into Europe, is so identifiable is in advanced forms, it will actually put holes in bones. So this is not a disease you want, not even now, right? So when they can find those sores and those breaks and holes in bones, that's one of the reasons we know that it's probably syphilis. But we are now able to extract bacterial DNA from the corpses, and we now have technology that allows us to see what people were dying from. And it'll still advance, right? And there's still all sorts of things we don't know yet. But it's the amazing technology that we have. We're able to pin things down in ways we've never been able to. When Crosby wrote the book, The Columbian Exchange, his position was syphilis had not been, that bacteria had not been in the Eastern Hemisphere before at all. Because at that point, we hadn't found any corpses where we could identify it. But 40 years later, we are now able to identify it, and we're able to pin it down much more easily. Yeah, when he reissued his book in 2003, it was published in '72 originally. He actually, in his foreword, apologizes for the mistakes he made about syphilis. So.
Did you raise your hand? Oh, sorry. Any other questions?
This is actually just a comment on the cell tower up on top of Everest. Last year, about this time, I was in Machu Picchu, and there's, you had cell service there, and yet there was a 20-year-old complaining about the speed of it. And I used to build cell towers and knew what it would take to get cell service in a remote place like Machu Picchu. So it was pretty funny.
Yeah. Yep. So much a part of our lives now. Right? Yeah. Remember when we could walk away from our phone? Right? Well, yes, you still can. Absolutely. It was just easier when it was on the wall and you could walk away from it. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Or
I'll throw in another funny anecdote. the town in France that I studied in Strasbourg, it's all the way closer to Germany, nowhere near the coast, but the old historic town center was called La Petite France, the Little France, but it's actually named that from when it was a German-speaking city. They called the downtown La Petite France because of French disease. Syphilis was so widespread there. And
That's amazing.
that was the German dig on French people that you know, they brought syphilis to Europe.
Yep. Blame everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I had a Spanish friend that was appalled that Americans love cattle food so much, talking about corn, and she said, "Why do you have flour over everything and fry it?"
I think the rest of the world questions a lot of things that we eat here, even though they contributed to an awful lot of it. Absolutely. Okay.
Any last questions?
Thank you so much for playing with these ideas with me and for your questions and comments. My email is up there on the slide if there's anything that you would like to ask me. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hann.
Absolutely.
Thanks
My
everyone
pleasure.
for being here. As a reminder, next Coffee with the Curator is April 17th. And we also have our next Senior Wednesday coming up on April 2nd. And that is at 1:30 p.m. for those who don't regularly attend. Dr. Leonard Kristalko will be visiting us from KU to give a talk called Forget Everything You Thought You Knew About Life, Biology, and Anthropology.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. Professor Kristalka is Emeritus Director of the Biodiversity Institute and Museum and the Emeritus Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So I hope to see you all at both of those things, Coffee with the Curator and Senior Wednesday, and take advantage of our 10% off sale that we have going on till Sunday. Thanks everyone and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.